If the previous episodes were the story of how this structure came into being and why it matters, this is the point at which we step inside the system itself. We move into the interior of the mechanism, a mechanism which, from the outside, may look like an ordinary terminal, but in reality resembles a precisely designed industrial organism. It works without interruption, day and night, regardless of weather, regardless of political tension, regardless of the military climate. Every single minute of downtime means real losses, losses that are immediately felt in the state budget, but also across global energy markets. The entire process begins hundreds of kilometers away from the island, deep inside Iranian territory, and also on extraction platforms scattered across the Persian Gulf. That is where crude oil is drawn from fields such as Ahwaz, Gachsaran, and Marun. From there, it enters the pipeline system, a system that can be compared to a bloodstream. It transports the resource continuously under constant pressure toward a central point. That point is Khark. This means the island does not function as an isolated entity. It is the endpoint of an enormous network stretching across the country. These pipelines are not merely simple transport lines. They form part of an advanced flow management system. Pressure is monitored. Temperature is monitored. The composition of the crude is monitored. The pace of transport is monitored. Different oil fields produce crude with different properties. Mixing them requires precision. Proper quality management is essential. It is precisely this that makes it possible to meet the expectations of buyers on international markets. When the oil reaches Khark, it is directed into gigantic storage tanks. These perform the role of a buffer. They separate extraction from export. They make flexible supply management possible. Extraction takes place continuously. The loading of tankers, by contrast, depends on schedules, on weather conditions, and on the market environment. That means the island must be capable of storing enormous quantities of crude for a defined period of time. It is those tanks, visible from the air as geometric circles arranged with near-perfect order, that form one of the key elements of the system. They make it possible to stabilize flow. They allow Iran to respond to shifts in demand. The pace of exports can be increased. It can also be reduced, and all of that can happen without the immediate need to adjust production. In practice, this gives the state greater control over trade. The next stage is loading. This is the moment at which the oil leaves the land-based system and enters the ships. The process is far more complicated than it may appear at first glance. It requires precise synchronization between the terminal and the vessel. It requires correct positioning of the tanker. It requires control over flow parameters. It requires the assurance of operational safety in procedures that often involve vessels exceeding 300 meters in length. Khark was designed to service the largest supertankers, including VLCC and ULCC classes. That imposes enormous demands on port infrastructure. It has to withstand immense mechanical loads. It has to cope with operational pressure. At the same time, it must ensure that loading remains rapid and efficient. The amount of time a ship spends in port translates directly into transport costs and therefore into the efficiency of the system as a whole. The oil trade itself, conducted through Khark, is every bit as complex as the logistics behind it. It does not consist merely of the physical loading of crude. It is a network of contracts, negotiations, and international relationships. State-owned enterprises take part in it, intermediaries take part in it, traders take part in it, final buyers take part in it. Every shipment is the result of prior arrangements concerning price, quality, and delivery timing. In that sense, Khark is something more than a port. It is a trading platform. It is a place where physical infrastructure meets the global financial system. Political and corporate decisions materialize here in a very concrete form, in the form of cargoes, in the form of tankers leaving the island, and in the form of routes leading to refineries in China, in India, and in Europe. Terminals of this kind do not perform a logistical function alone. They also perform a regulatory one. They make it possible to manage supply. They make it possible to influence the market. In Iran's case, this carries particular importance, especially in the context of sanctions and trade restrictions. Yet what distinguishes Khark from many other terminals around the world is the level of military protection surrounding it that follows directly from its strategic importance. The island is protected by air defense systems, by naval units, and by forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It is treated as one of the most important infrastructure points in the country. The military presence does not stop at the island itself. It extends into the surrounding waters as well. Fast boats patrol them, warships patrol them, monitoring systems watch over them. Together they create a layered defensive structure. Its aim is to deter potential adversaries, but also to ensure a rapid response to sabotage, to incidents, and to military action. At the same time, Khark operates under conditions of permanent tension. Its importance makes it a potential target in times of crisis. That imposes the need to maintain a high level of readiness. It imposes the need for constant investment in security systems, both physical and technological, including monitoring, cybersecurity, and the protection of critical infrastructure. There is something else worth noticing as well. The island is not only an industrial installation, it is also a lived space. A space inhabited and operated by thousands of workers who keep the system running. That means that alongside the industrial infrastructure, there is also social infrastructure, residential infrastructure, and technical infrastructure. The result is something resembling a closed city, a city operating according to its own rules, subordinated to a single objective, maintaining continuity of operations. It is precisely this combination of elements that matters most: advanced logistics, global trade, strong military protection. Together, they create a system unlike almost any other. Khark becomes one of the most complex elements of energy infrastructure in the world, but at the same time, one of the most efficient. It works like a finely tuned mechanism, a mechanism in which every part must function perfectly, because otherwise the consequences do not stop at one country. They spread outward in waves through the entire system of the global economy. If one looks at Khark not as a static infrastructure point, but as a timeline, as a record of the events that have swept through Iran and the wider region, then the island ceases to be merely a terminal. It begins to resemble a seismograph of the global economy, an instrument that records every tremor in the market, every conflict, every political shift, and translates them into concrete numbers: barrels, prices, export volumes. The first moment in which Khark was truly tested was the Islamic Revolution of 1979. That event did not merely transform Iran's political system. It also shook its oil sector. It led to a drop in production. It produced organizational chaos. The new authorities had to take control of infrastructure that had previously been built in cooperation with the West. That meant the breaking of certain technological ties and commercial relationships. During that period, Khark did not stop functioning, but its operations were constrained. Oil exports, which had earlier been one of the pillars of the global market, declined sharply. The consequences were immediate. Crude prices reacted. This revealed something very clearly. The world is deeply dependent on the stability even of a single producer. An even greater test came with the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. During that period, Khark became one of the main targets of attack, both from the air and from the sea. Saddam Hussein understood perfectly well what this island meant. To strike Khark was to attempt to cut Iran off from oil export revenues, and therefore to weaken its ability to wage war. The island was bombed repeatedly. Infrastructure suffered destruction. Export operations were interrupted or constrained. This led to violent fluctuations in export levels and further destabilized a global market already under pressure from regional conflict. And yet Khark endured. It was rebuilt while the war was still ongoing, often in improvised form, sometimes under extreme conditions. That fact alone shows the scale of its importance to Iran. Even the partial restoration of operations was treated as a strategic priority, more important than many other elements of infrastructure. After the war came a period of reconstruction and modernization. Iran sought to restore previous export levels, but not only that. It also sought to increase the island's operational capabilities. This coincided with a period of relative oil price stability in the 1990s, although prices continued to move in cycles shaped by broader economic trends. During that time, Khark once again became the central point of export. Its importance grew even further. Iran was rebuilding its economy after war and needed stable revenues that could be secured only through uninterrupted oil exports. Every investment in the island was therefore also an investment in state stability. The beginning of the 21st century brought another set of challenges. This time, they did not take the form of direct military conflict. The leading role was played by international sanctions. Those sanctions restricted Iran's export possibilities. They affected production levels. They affected market access. Khark, despite retaining its operational capacity, could not always function at full speed. A distinct paradox emerged. The infrastructure was capable of handling volumes far larger than those actually being exported. Excess capacity encountered limited access to customers. That forced Iran to search for alternative sales channels that were less transparent and more logistically complicated. Exports did not disappear. Their structure changed. Khark remained the principal point of departure, but the operations became more complicated. They came to include altered shipping routes, ship-to-ship transfers at sea, and the use of intermediary fleets. The system continued to function, but it became more hidden, more flexible, and more complex. At the same time, global oil prices in the 21st century were subject to severe fluctuations. There were periods of record highs. There were also moments of deep decline. The financial crisis of 2008, the later waves of turbulence, the pandemic, geopolitical tension. All of this had a direct impact on the importance of Khark. When prices were high, every exported barrel generated greater revenue. When prices were low, the pressure to increase volume intensified. In recent years, the island has once again found itself at the center of attention as tensions between Iran and the United States intensified, not only as an infrastructure point, but also as a potential strategic target. This recalls the situation of the 1980s, but in a new context, with new technologies and much stronger global interdependence. In that sense, the history of Khark is a history of adaptation, of continuous adjustment to changing conditions. The island functions despite conflict, despite sanctions, despite market volatility. That makes it one of the most resilient elements of energy infrastructure in the world, but also one of the most heavily tested. And that is why Khark is not merely a witness to history. It is an active participant in it. It is a place where global processes take material form in very concrete ways, in the form of logistical operations. Every political change, every economic change, immediately translates into the tempo of the pumps, into the level of the tanks, and into the number of tankers waiting to load. This creates an image of a world that often seems abstract, but in reality rests on very specific points, physical points, tangible points, such as this small island in the Persian Gulf. The relationship between Khark and Israel is not an obvious one. It does not run along the line of direct conflict, nor is it an open confrontation. It develops in the shadows, in the realm of analysis, observation, and strategic calculation. In this setting, the island becomes not so much an objective in itself as an element of a larger security puzzle. In that puzzle, every fragment of an adversary's infrastructure matters. It can serve as a pressure point. It can serve as a source of knowledge about capabilities, about weaknesses, and about the limits of resilience. For Israel, Iran has for decades remained one of the principal strategic challenges. It is a state studied with the highest degree of attention in technological, military, and political terms. In that context, Khark appears as a particularly significant point. It concentrates within itself what is most important for any state: the ability to generate income, maintain stability, and finance the machinery of government. In Israeli security logic, an adversary's energy infrastructure is not neutral. It forms part of that adversary's strategic potential. That is why oil terminals, pipelines, and ports are analyzed in ways similar to military bases and industrial installations. Their destruction or disruption can produce effects comparable to military action, often with a lower level of escalation, but with a very real outcome. Khark fits this logic in almost textbook fashion. It is the principal point of Iranian oil exports. Its importance makes it both one of the state's most important assets and one of its most vulnerable points. That is why it becomes an object of interest for analysts, planners, and potentially operational services as well. Israel has no direct access to the Persian Gulf. That limits the classic options for action. There is no room here for a traditional military presence. Influence has to take other forms. It rests on intelligence, on cyber operations, on indirect action, on methods that make it possible to shape the situation without requiring open engagement. In that context, Khark ceases to be only a terminal. It becomes an object of reconnaissance, a place examined in the smallest detail. The infrastructure, the procedures, the defenses, all of this falls under observation. To understand how the island functions is to understand one of the key mechanisms of the Iranian state. The region's energy infrastructure increasingly finds itself at the center of non-kinetic operations, operations that do not take the form of open attack. Cyber attacks, sabotage, disruption of systems. These are instruments that make it possible to achieve strategic objectives without crossing the threshold of war. It is in such an environment that Khark operates on a daily basis. That means permanent danger, a danger that is often invisible. It does not take the form of spectacular strikes. It is dispersed, difficult to attribute, active in the background, in systems, in networks. This increases the importance of technological safeguards, monitoring systems, access control, and cybersecurity. Israel, as a state with high technological and intelligence capabilities, views places such as Khark in layered fashion. They are not merely potential targets, they are also sources of information. Every element of infrastructure can provide data. Control systems, operating procedures, methods of flow management. All of this makes it possible to understand the adversary more deeply. At the same time, the relationship is not one-sided. Iran is also aware of this interest. It adjusts its own actions. It develops systems of protection, redundancy, and concealment. It creates additional layers of security. This leads to a kind of technological race. Each side seeks to gain an advantage in the sphere of information and in the capacity to influence events. In broader terms, Khark fits into what might be called a shadow war, a conflict without a single front, unfolding simultaneously across multiple domains, at sea, in cyberspace, and within critical infrastructure. The boundaries between peace and conflict are fluid here. Actions by one side are often met by a response from the other, but in a different place and in a different form. The island is therefore not the stage for spectacular operations of the kind that dominate front pages. It is rather a point of tension. It exists in the background, in scenarios, in plans, in analyses, rarely visible in public, yet exerting real influence on the way states in the region perceive their security. In that sense, Khark and Israel are linked by a relationship that is indirect but intense. It is based on awareness of the importance of infrastructure and of its role in modern conflict. Control over the flows of energy, information, and finance becomes as important as control over territory itself, and that is why the island remains one of those places which, although far from direct front lines, sit at the center of strategic attention. In a world where wars are increasingly fought not only on battlefields but within systems and networks, Khark is one of the key nodes, a node whose significance extends far beyond its physical boundaries. If the earlier episodes presented Khark as part of the official economic system, as a port inscribed into global trade and recognized by markets, institutions, and states, then this is where the second story of the same island begins, a story less visible, less formal, but at many moments equally important, because it reveals something crucial. Even the most centralized infrastructure can adapt, especially when official rules cease to apply. Trade does not disappear, it simply changes form. The sanctions imposed on Iran had one primary objective: to limit the state's ability to export oil, and therefore reduce both its income and its influence on the international stage. In theory, this should have struck directly at the functioning of Khark, reduced its importance, and lowered the volume of operations. In practice, the system did not stop. It did not switch off. It did not cease to function. It began to transform itself. Gradually, it shifted from the official sphere to the semi-official sphere, and then into the gray zone. The boundaries between legal trade and its circumvention began to blur. The terminal ceased to be only a port. It became the point of departure for operations that do not always appear in official statistics. Tankers leaving Khark began to disappear from radar, not physically, but digitally. They switched off their AIS identification systems. Under normal conditions, those systems make it possible to track ship movements around the world. Turning them off meant entering a space of invisibility. Routes ceased to be public. Cargoes ceased to be obvious. Destinations became uncertain. Trade became much harder to monitor. At the same time, ship-to-ship transfers at sea began to appear, often in distant areas. Oil from one tanker was pumped into another. In the process, it changed its identity: a new vessel, a new flag, new documentation. The second ship could continue the journey as carrier of a cargo that, formally speaking, no longer came from Iran. A system began to take shape that resembled a labyrinth, a system in which the origin of the product became difficult to establish with certainty. The ships themselves changed as well. Their registrations changed, their owners changed, their operators changed. Many vessels began to function within so-called shadow fleets. These structures rested on networks of intermediary companies, often registered in different jurisdictions. That made responsibility harder to pin down. It made sanctions harder to enforce. It created a parallel transport system, one functioning alongside the official market. Exports did not disappear, their structure changed. They continued to flow mainly toward Asia and especially toward China. This reveals something important. Sanctions do not eliminate the movement of raw materials. They change the channels through which those materials are distributed. They shift operations into a less transparent and more logistically complex space. In this new model, Khark does not lose importance. On the contrary, it gains new functions. It becomes the beginning of a system operating on two levels at once. The first level is official, visible, and regulated. The second is unofficial, hidden, and flexible. The island functions as an interface between those two worlds, between legality and semi-legality. At the same time, oil trade under sanctions becomes more demanding. It requires creativity. It requires acceptance of risk. Every operation has to take into account the possibility of detection, interception, or blockage. The participants in the system operate under conditions of uncertainty: ship operators, traders, intermediaries. The entire structure begins to resemble a strategic game rather than classical trade. In that sense, Khark ceases to be merely a place of export. It becomes a symbol of the adaptive capacity of the state, a state that, despite restrictions, is still capable of maintaining the flow of crude and the flow of revenue. This is of fundamental importance for economic stability. Even the partial maintenance of exports makes it possible to finance the basic functions of the state. Yet this model has its price. Trade in the gray zone means lower prices, higher logistical costs, greater risk. The system functions, but it is not as efficient as it would be under conditions of full integration with the global market. Over the long term, that affects the country's development possibilities. A paradox also emerges. Sanctions, instead of completely stopping exports, lead to the creation of an alternative system, one harder to control and more resistant to classical instruments of pressure. That changes the character of the entire game between states. It shifts it from the level of official relations to the level of concealed operations. Khark therefore functions in two realities at once, as an official export terminal and as the starting point of a network designed to bypass restrictions. That makes it one of the most complex infrastructure points in the world, a place where law, economics, and geopolitics meet in forms that are not always visible, but are always present. And it is precisely this duality, openness and concealment, legality and circumvention, that explains why Khark, in the age of sanctions, does not lose significance. It evolves. It adapts to conditions that for many systems would be destructive. For Khark, they become merely the next stage of operation in a world where trade never truly disappears. It simply changes its shape.